Welcome back to This Was Supposed to Be Easy, your go-to podcast for connection, joy, and a good dose of laughter.
Hosted by two friends who've seen enough of life to know that it's never as simple as it sounds.
Or looks.
Each conversation celebrates the diverse journeys we travel, the moments of bravery, the strength we didn't know we had, and the joy we find along the way.
Because let's be honest, life is full of things that were supposed to be easy, but turned out to be harder.
And definitely funnier
than we thought. This is Amy.
And this is Cheryl. And if it were easy, we wouldn't be here. Today, we are excited to try something new with all of you. I have a friend and colleague named Ranee Conley, who is going to join Amy and I today to talk about a book. And so just as a quick way of introducing this, I was at a conference with Ranee and she sat down and she's like, "Have you read this book, The Midnight Library?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And she said, "Well, I need you to read it so that we can sit down with a glass of wine and talk about it." And I was like, okay, that sounds like a great challenge. And I'm about to get on an airplane. So the timing was perfect. I downloaded the audiobook, listened to it on the plane ride home, and then, finished it later on. In the meantime, I told Amy about the book and said, "Amy, in all of your spare time, how about you also read or listen to this book?" And I was actually, Amy, quite surprised when it was hardly any time later that you said, "I finished it." So I approached Ranee and said, that glass of wine idea, what if we did a podcast conversation about it? Not instead, but in addition to sitting down with that glass of wine. And so by way of very rambling introductions, I would like to welcome Ranee to the podcast and let you all know that we are going to talk about the book, The Midnight Library, and we want to have an open, frank conversation about our thoughts about the book and the different ideas shared in the book, which means that if you haven't read the book and you're thinking about reading the book, you have a couple of choices. The first choice is you could view this as, well, I'm just going to go to the movie before I read the book and listen to everything anyway. Or you could say, nope, I'm not going to listen to this episode until after I've read the book. Or you could just say, not going to read the book, want to hear what y'all have to say about it. So the invitation is yours, but we will be talking about the book. And so having said that, gosh, Ranee, Amy, do either of you want to give a quick kind of synopsis of what the book is about so that my voice doesn't get old?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about the book. So the book starts, I should say the book is written by Matt Haig. And as you had described, it is called The Midnight Library. And it's about the main female character. Her name is Nora. And early on in the story, within the first 2 chapters, she decides that life is just not worth living anymore. And so she does take active steps to end her life. So that is kind of a trigger warning for anyone that is extra sensitive to topics that involve that. But in saying so, what happens as she's kind of in a crossing over field, she comes across a library. And in this library, she sees someone that she knows from her past. It is the librarian who's telling her about all of the books. And in these books are versions of Nora's life that could have been lived. And so as she starts reading them or picking them up, she sees all the different opportunities that she had through the choices that she made in her current existence. So at any point in her life that she could have done one thing or could have done another. So a degree that she could have picked or participating in a specific sport for longer than she did. She could have looked at how her life would have turned out differently. And she was then told at any point in time, if there was a story that felt really good, that she could stay in it. And what would happen then kind of leads to the rest of the book. So we can talk a little bit about that. I won't go into too much detail, but it's really about the choices that we make and how that impacts the outcomes of what we have, which is right on par for oftentimes what we talk about here in the podcast.
Right. If I had done something differently, what might the outcome be? Ranee, is there anything you would, I don't know, add to that or something that you think is a key part of the book?
I think the biggest part for me, which is why I begged people I love and enjoy conversation and wine with to read the book, is that I felt like it seemed so cliche to tell people, I read this book and it was so amazing and it really impacted my heart and my mind. And it's all about the choices you make and the consequences of those choices. I felt like that description almost seems trite. And so I needed somebody's to read it and experience it with me, because all of the recommendations said, "Oh, you're going to love this book." But it felt hollow just to describe it without other people who have lived it.
No. Well, okay. One of the things I would say that was so interesting is when I was going to the library to get this book, the librarian at my local library had said, "Oh, I read this. Keep a box of Kleenex. It's a really sad one." And I thought, like, "Oh gosh, what am I signing up for?" So I made my sister read it too, and we talked about it. And I was like, I'm perplexed because I read the book feeling actually a sense of hope and didn't feel sad by it. I felt like there were opportunities along the way that it felt really insightful versus sad to me. So I'd love to know kind of your thoughts on that as well.
It's interesting, right? And I believe that at its depth is part of why this book is so impactful, because it is our perspective. It is the lens through which we see and read and engage people. I didn't experience it as so much sadness either. So it is interesting that that was her immediate, oh, this is a tearjerker.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't so many touching moments, but again, I think that's what makes this book so impactful, is our perspective is so heavily woven into how we process it.
Mm-hmm. It really made me think about, I don't know about you two, but have you had those moments in your life where you're like, oh, my life would have been so much better if I had just done this, or if I had not done that, if I had chosen differently. And I think that's one of the first things that it did for me, was just make me think about a few of those moments where, I question, what would my life look like if I had done X or Y? But as I listened to, and again, I'm going to say listened because that's how I experienced the book. As I listened to Nora try different opportunities, I think something that just kept coming around to me was, why do I take this one thing and think, oh, if I had just done that, my life would be so much better?
Mhm. I think for me, what that concept, right, which really is my perception is the big concept of the book, right? All these different opportunities and what you say yes to and what you say no to, what you value, so what you put energy into, all of that. I feel like I already walked that journey when I was much younger. Interestingly, I would say in my mid to late 30s, which is this character's age. Still, though, it was I loved the ride of, and we're doing like all the spoilers are happening, right? I
Yes.
loved my favorite ride with her, honestly, was the rock star one,
Yeah.
right? Like imagining what it would be like to have that. And then what were the unintended consequences, right? The tragic unintended consequences. None of us ever imagine if we decide this or that. So you might want to say more about the different choices. There's another theme that really connects with me now, I think, as I know now.
Mhm. So maybe just to backtrack a little bit, as Nora's in this library and there are all of these different books, it's not that she could just open a book and see what would have happened. It was more that she kept getting these prompts from her former librarian who was in the library. Think about a choice you regret.
Mhm.
or that you've wondered about or that you've questioned, and choose that as the impetus for testing out a life. And then again, she didn't just open a book and read it. She all of a sudden was in that life, in that moment in time where she was, as you just referred to, Renee, a rock star, right? So she had been in a band with her brother and some of his friends, and I think had left the band. This is where my memory leaves me a little bit. But in this one life, she had stayed in the band and she was a famous rock star, very famous rock star. But in that life, in other versions of herself, which we can talk about what some of those are, you don't realize this means this other person in my life that I loved might not be alive anymore. Or, that this person I met in real life, I never got to meet, or, whatever that might be. And so, she's dropped into this life, but she doesn't know everything that led up to it. All she knows is the choice she made. And so, there was this moment where she's on stage as a speaker, as a famous speaker. She has no idea what her keynote is supposed to be about because she didn't live up until that moment where she had written the book that led to the keynote. Or as the rock star, she's on stage and she doesn't know the songs. What is she going to sing for the encore, which is where she landed. And so you really do have to think about, what does this mean?
Well, and it's funny you say that because when I talked to my sister about this, she was like, those parts right there caused her such anxiety. She's like,
Me too.
I was, she's like, just the idea of being an Olympian and then being up there giving a keynote in front of thousands of people and you don't know what you're doing, or when you're on the stage and singing a song and you don't know the words. And she's like, that just gave me like, she's like, why couldn't it have been like, you come with the knowledge base, or like you understand that. That made me think then too, you're thinking about it, those experiences through the lens of the life that you've lived today, right? So her life that she decided to end is ultimately the lens that she was then perceiving all these other lives through, to
Mhm.
realize that this wasn't really where she wanted to be. Those were decisions, and ultimately were the decisions of other people in her life that they had for her, right? I mean, that's kind of what it came around to, that in any of those options, she wouldn't have been living for herself. She would have been living to make all the other people in her life happy. And those choices had consequences. But it did make me think, like, what if this book was written from any other perspective of a life? So like the idea of, let's go with the rock star one. The negative side of it was she was lonely when she was in that life. She had who she thought was the perfect movie star boyfriend and realized that nope, that didn't work. Her family member was no longer in the picture due to drug addiction and things like that. She had a lot of complications. She was constantly on the go. She didn't really have a relationship with her family. All of those types of things. So I wonder then, if the book was written from that perspective, that lens, to look at the life she did have, what would the thought have been of the life that she thought was so terrible to start with?
Wow, I hadn't even thought of that, but can you imagine flipping that?
Yeah. I think it goes to show that like you only know what you know. I think of one of my kind of crossroads I have talked about before. I was in school to become a counselor, and I was at the tail end of my program, and I was 4 months, well, actually at the very tail end of the program, I was 2 weeks away from having my first child. And about 4 months prior to that, I was given the opportunity to become an early childhood education director, or director at a center, in a role that I didn't have a lot of experience, really any experience in. And my plan was always to become a child therapist. What ended up happening was I had written a Plan B paper, which was this huge 120-page paper. I took it to my advisor and she read one page and said, I thought you were going to do a quantitative study. This is a qualitative study. I'm not going to read anymore. And I was heartbroken and very pregnant and very emotional and working quite a few hours, and just said, you know what? I don't want to be a therapist anyway. And instead, I didn't know how to advocate to myself. Now, This version of me would have went and said, okay, department chair, like, let's give me another advisor. Like, we're going to do things differently. But I didn't at that time,
Right.
and always thought I would go back to it. And I didn't, and ended up meeting Cheryl in a more formal way as she became my advisor as I added on an early childhood degree. And really, my life ever since then has been very rooted in early childhood, which that was never the intention. The intention was to be a counselor. And so if I think of things, I wonder, okay, what life would have looked like had I gone the counselor route? However, for myself and knowing who I am now and knowing where I was struggling in that, I think I would have hated it. It's one of those things that I love coaching. I love helping people figure out their life path. I love all of those things, but actually as an active role as a counselor, and I have had multiple opportunities of people to ask me, "Hey, would you be willing to come back to that?" And even been offered positions. And I've always said, you know what? No, I don't want to revisit that, because now years later, I mean, many
Mhm.
years later, I can say, yeah, I really think that would have been terrible. And the best thing that could have happened was that, even though in that time period, it felt detrimental.
As I'm listening to you talk, Amy, there was this ongoing thread that kind of kept going through my brain. And I don't want to jump right to that. I think at the beginning of this book, there were those big things, right? Like you just talked about this big moment
Yeah,
where,
huge.
this person said to me, I'm not even reading another step. And that was a very swift change in direction. And those lives that the main character experienced were vast and varied because she would pick whole different aspects, right? Like,
Yes.
I was a swimmer and I quit swimming to do these other things or to become this other person. What if I had kept swimming? Or my passion was glaciology and I love studying glaciers and I wanted to be out there on the boat studying glaciers. What if I had gone down that path? Or the rock star piece. They were very large changes, but there was this other thread that I just kept thinking, but what if it wasn't that big? What if it was something much smaller? And it just makes me wonder, Renee, what made you say, I've got to find somebody to talk about? Like what piece is that, just that urging piece for you that you wanted to talk about?
Well, I'm gonna back up a little bit and then go there.
Okay.
So, full transparency, I've got this huge wish list of my Audible books and then the books I want to read physically and how I think I make decisions around that. This one was highly recommended. And I am already a believer in ultimately things happen the way they're supposed to. And so the things that seem big and the things that seem little,
Mm,
both. So I am very frugal, very money aware, and I have a subscription to Audible, and I paid for this book. I used my credit for it. I started it 3 times.
okay.
I struggled getting into it. Then it was starting to connect with me. The moment I said I'm into it was one of her early choices. I don't know, second, third, but where she understood why her cat died.
Mm,
Yeah. The cat was always going to die. Yeah.
Cat was always gonna die. And that is, and I feel that's where I feel like weeping, not in a sadness, but just in the depth of that wisdom we could connect to if we stay right in the perspective that helps us connect to that. Definitely the place I'm at in my journey right now is hyper awareness of the things where I place blame or I accept blame, whether someone else has actually put it on me or not. And that was one of the deepest, like, I have to find somebody to talk about this. That because of the perspectives we have, and especially for me, I'll make an assumption. And I think I'm being so self aware or whatever, but I don't stop to think this is all based on this assumption that I
mhm.
could have done something so that my cat didn't die. I'm such a bad cat owner. That's why this happened. And that was like a huge stopping moment for me to connect to the things I'm aware of and the things I'm sure I'm not aware of yet, where I still think, only if only I just said yes to this or no to that, or this other person is in a circumstance I could have helped when maybe the cat was going to die anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to release ourselves of that in a healthy way so that we can keep reframing and reconsidering our perspectives and also moving forward and not being so stuck. So that was for me the first, okay, I'm in. This story is going to touch me deeply.
As you were talking about, like thinking about that context of blame, like when I automatically blame, I also was thinking about sort of that flip of it, which is when you give up control because this happened to me or the should happen to me, like someone don't should on me is one of my favorite,
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite sayings. But every time I catch myself, well, not every time, I try to catch it more often, right? But when it might be a scenario where I'm maybe trying to blame, but sometimes it's I can't do this because all of these things happened to me, and it's giving up control and giving up power. And I kept thinking as she tried out all of these different lives, but where is your power?
So I'm just going to weave over here for a minute. So, one of the bodies of work I'm super passionate about in my career is
Mhm,
the work of conscious discipline, which is
mhm,
a framework for supporting adults, supporting children, triune brain. And I've been studying and training and now teaching at the college around this content. And sounds so cliche, but it's such a journey. And finding the balance of acceptance, I think, is what I'm thinking about when you say that piece is acceptance isn't giving up, but allows us to accept the moment is as it is. The choices are what they are. Now what?
mhm.
Right? The piece of acceptance and that piece of blame. 5 years ago, I would have said, I blame is not in my, that's not one of my barriers. And having awareness, wow, so much a barrier, really both directions. I accept blame when maybe people didn't even weren't even putting it on me for other people. And when I recognize that I'm going to say unhealthy and seeking to place blame so that I can not accept responsibility for where I'm at and move forward. Those were those. I'm reading the story of, right, the different choices she made. Thank you for clarifying that. She didn't say, what if I became this? What if I became that?
Right,
What if I
right.
made this choice? What were the outcomes? I become really thoughtful. I'm better at it when I'm supporting children, right? What are the intended outcomes? And then what can I imagine are the unintended outcomes? But that's life.
I think, Renee, as you were saying that and talking about the blame piece, a few years ago, after doing some work in therapy and also just
Mhm.
kind of a perspective I took into this book is, so looking at where one of my issues was, is that I always kind of saw myself as a fixer. I was the type of person I was often felt like I was relied on to make sure that everybody else's existence was as comfortable as possible. And a few years ago, I really realized that in doing so, not only was I making myself uncomfortable, but I was robbing people of the opportunity to learn from their own situations.
Mhm.
And this book really helped me kind of solidify those own thoughts that I've had for myself as the character, by doing some of those things, by making the journey of the other people's lives easier. So she thought
Mhm.
it really, in a lot of ways, made their lives harder. Like there was her best friend. Her best friend at the time wanted her to go to Australia with her and live abroad. She went to go do that, and in doing so, she was really in a sad existence, and the best friend had passed away just from like a frivolous night of kind of fun. And so, though she always felt guilt that her friend had a harder time kind of going to begin with, and then their friendship fell apart a little bit, all that more to say the friendship probably always was going to fall apart a little bit. It just happened at different points in time. And also, by her taking that blame and not going, life would have been so much harder for everyone involved had she gone. And so I think because of that, I always think of like, okay, what am I robbing of somebody else by making this decision if I think I know better? And also that too, why do I think I know better than somebody else about their own life? Because I mean, we oftentimes can almost oversee it like we're watching TV and think, oh, if you just do this, this, and this, you'll be so much better. You'll be so much, it'll be fine. And what kind of challenges that can bring in as well.
I don't know if I'm really jumping topic right now, but I will put this out there and see what you all think. One of the things, so I'm gonna go back to that panic that your sister Ashley and I had, when she would arrive in this life and not know the words to say or not know
Yeah.
who to ask for, the song to sing, or it was like, and she'd have to Google her own self and life to try to piece it together. And as that was happening, and as I was feeling very uncomfortable with where she would land and how does she deal with this without sounding crazy and telling people I wasn't here yesterday, it was this idea that, some of these lives were more attractive to her than others, right? So there were times when she was only in a life for a few minutes. And there were times when she was in it for days or maybe even weeks, and would grow more comfortable with the person she had become in that life and acting that way. But that's how I felt like she was making her progress, right? She got better at acting like she had been there for the whole journey. And that journey piece is so important, right? I just feel like I just kept getting that message that you can't just skip over all of the journey, all of the processes, all of the living and feel right at where you land. She felt like she was stealing it from someone else, I think. It wasn't really
Mhm.
hers because she hadn't lived into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting thing when she said that, like she was felt like she was stealing it from somebody else because she
Mhm.
hadn't done the work kind of up into that point to become that version of herself.
Yeah.
And I thought a lot about, at first I felt the panic.
Mhm.
So this was my journey with it. At first I was like, oh, and then there was a moment for me. I'm like, I don't like this. This is hard for me to believe that you could just Google it. And so it took me out of it for a minute. But then I also really connected with, and Cheryl, you and I have talked about this before. It connected for me the moments where I feel my own imposter syndrome,
Mm.
you know? And so even though I don't even know that that was an intended theme, I thought, how many times am I asked to train on something or speak about something that I knew about 25 years ago, but I haven't thought about it? And I said yes, and tomorrow's the day. I'm not all the way prepared, but I can do this, right? And so I did think, actually, I think that does resonate for me.
I love that you, Amy, and we all have that same feeling and that same that same experience of sure, we'll talk about it. We'll get ourselves there.
Right.
I think one of the other underlying themes that really kind of played through in and out that was really profound was her wanting to live. There was a part in the story that the library started to crumble. And it was because she had come out of a life saying, all these lives are terrible. Like, why do I want to do this? If this is what I was supposed to be, like, nothing feels right. And I think too, it really wasn't until she started to like aspects of herself within each of the lives that she kind of kept. Like and when she was glacier, like, how do you pronounce that word, Cheryl? How did you?
I said glaciologist, and I
Okay.
feel like that must be in my head from listening to the book.
Okay. And that would make sense. I read it and I'm like, I don't know how to say this word. So the fact that you both listened to it, that it's one of the pros of listening to a book, right?
Mm.
But she comes across a bear. And after the bear, she feels much more brave. And she kind of, you can see where she takes that bravery throughout other aspects of her now new existences. But it really all kind of came down to the initial, like, I want this. I want to know what's going to happen next. I want to know. And then I think the other profound thing that was really interesting is she could have continued to jump around to lives. In fact, she, met another individual who was doing that and loved living little bits of time in all the lives that he had. And it wasn't until she kind of said, like, yeah, it's interesting. And really, went through many, many lives in very short bursts. But it wasn't until she said, like, no, I think I want to settle down and see where it goes. Like, I want to see a life fully through until, like, there was even really that option, right? Like, I think instead of, and so I do wonder, if you were the main character in this book, for either one of you, do you think you would want to hop around into not only see the lives that you think of, but all the other little, you caught the train, you didn't catch the train, you went to eat at this restaurant, you didn't eat at this restaurant, the little ones, and test them out? Or do you think you would want to find a life that you thought, I want to see that one through to the end, with the good and the bad?
I'm going to zip it, see if Ranee has an answer.
Well, for me, I I feel like that's part of where I'm at. That I've definitely been struggling with purpose, thinking about, so it's not exactly the answer to your question, but it's authentic to what I'm experiencing. So right before I read The Midnight Library, I explored, did not read or listen to several books around, kind of what's next at this phase in life, right? So I will be 57 next month and thinking about my day to day. What do I do day in and day out? Am I really spending time on what I value? Or am I just repeating the things I think I should do? I don't even think about. I read something recently about, if an alien came to study me for a week, would they know what I value? And that really struck me. I thought, no, I'm not really spending my time on what I value. And then the influences. So I think about in the book, in the story, her father really wanted her to be the swimmer and all of that. And while she enjoyed it and she was gifted and all of the things, ultimately, if she chose that life, she was choosing it for him. At least that was how I
Yeah.
received it. So I also think about, as old as I am, where are the shoulds? Where are people, oh, you should really do this. You should really do that. And how much I know I still battle trying to please people and be who people think I am or think I should be, that really isn't a match most of the time for who I know I really am.
Mhm.
So I think I am trying to answer your question.
No,
I think I
it feels
am
like you're
playing
answering.
with
Yeah.
it, right?
Hmm.
What if I do this and I'll play it out as long as it plays out? And then if I don't like the direction we're going, I can play out something different.
Mhm.
And that feels so connected to, was this successful or did this fail? Reframing all of that. Is this what I wanted it to be or not? And it goes back to your big moment, right? When you submit your 120 pages and they read one page, all those big moments and the small ones too.
I remember quite a few years ago when I was teaching a course for the student teachers in early childhood. And I engaged them in this process of watching and observing the children and looking for those ordinary moments that were extraordinary. And I thought of that when you were talking, Ranee, just the idea of each moment speaking to, am I truly genuinely living in my purpose or with
Mhm,
purpose? Am I present,
mhm,
or am I just running in the hamster wheel?
mhm,
Am I thinking about the choices that I make or just letting them happen? Am I engaged with others? Am I really here, embracing those ordinary moments and making sure that more of the moments that I'm living are moments connected to who I want to be, versus just, I have to get this done.
Mhm.
I really think that's a lot of where my thoughts went, when she just kept realizing, oh, this great thing didn't make me happy. This great thing didn't make me happy. Even when I married this guy that I had originally declined a coffee date for, and now I accepted it, and boom, look, now we have this beautiful child, and she, loved this child. It's still, she hadn't spent those moments. She hadn't even experienced a lot of those ordinary moments, right? But she hadn't made those purposeful, smaller steps to build that life. And it helped that desire grow in me even more to try to step back more often and not be in the race, to think about, is this really what I want to do, or how I want to spend this Saturday or this Sunday, even, like I have this huge to-do list piling up. Amy and I have done episodes on not letting the to-do list run our life, right? But it is building right now. And what did I do on Sunday? I very purposefully chose, no, I have some seeds that I've been cold stratifying, and I need to plant those seeds so that I can enjoy the flowers that I want to enjoy this summer, so that I can make food with them or create art with them. And, I really had to step back and say, you can jump on the wheel again today, or you can say, no, I'm going to smell the dirt and plant the seeds and look for the sunshine spots to help them grow. And I feel like I felt that differently and appreciated that more because of the thoughts that had emerged as I was listening to the book.
I think about all of that as well, with that there doesn't have to be a set timeline. That was kind of another theme that I took away from it. And it goes a little bit to what you're saying too, Cheryl, like those moments that make it, as she was with that person that she loved and really liked but didn't feel completely fulfilled because she wasn't there for the early phases, when she did kind of go back into the life that she had and she realized what she wanted more, you could kind of see that it was on the pathway to lead to something similar, or a similar version of that life. But one of the things that she kind of learned in that last opportunity is that who she was as a human in the life that she had impacted other people so positively. And those people that she was impacting positively and she genuinely cared about, she didn't even realize, and their lives would have been very, very different. And she felt a sense of remorse in a way that she didn't for all the lives that happened differently, because she saw it different. And so I think too, like those moments, what you're saying, but ultimately I think there's not a timeline. We might have an imaginary timeline in our head of, oh, if I don't reach this level of success by this point, it's not going to happen. Or if I don't write a book by this point, it's not going to happen. Or if I don't start a podcast by this point, it's not going to happen. Those types of things. And I think that goes to show, like, that's only if you make it that way. Like you have the choice to say, like, hey, it might not be on the timeline that I originally had hoped for, but if it's something I really want, then it's still worth doing, and doing it in a way that works for who you are now, or who you are today.
And I'm just going to connect to that, the timeline, and then the outcome is the best word I can think of. So that was the experience working on writing a book that I chose to never publish because I grew in this direction, which maybe drove me to shift, rather than I started this, I'm going to finish it. And it's all in balance, right? If we start 100 things that right, that's not what I'm talking about. But there are so many moments in time, I think about the decision to stay or change, and that's not failure. I've become this now, or I've had this experience now, And for me specifically, it is almost always goes back to, I'm almost there. Is this as fulfilling as I thought it would be? And questioning, is this about the extrinsic, what it looked like for her to, I'm going to say, play family, because she didn't build up to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so was that in part, like you said, once she went back to her root life to move forward, I got the sense it could still go in a very similar direction,
Yes.
but she would have had all the intrinsic motivation and connection to it rather than just what it looks like on the outside.
Mm-hmm. It brings that question of, here in this life, in my real life as I'm living it now, instead of just dreaming, oh, what if I had done that instead?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, to ask myself, maybe, is there a little choice I can make?
So, where I do wonder with this, like with the whole story and the way that it kind of all goes, and especially to our listeners out there who maybe have read the book or have just listened to our discussion, I wonder, have you thought about the choices that you've made in your life? And have you, in age and wisdom or age and experience, have you come to a point where you maybe think that, I could have done that differently, but I probably wouldn't have liked the outcome? Or, yeah, you know what? There's still an opportunity to do something differently. What has this conversation meant, as well as, if you've read the book, what did it make you think? And then if you haven't read the book, do you want to? And, maybe have some of those thoughts.
One of the quotes that I have was a shifting moment for me in a particular position that I had, a job that I had, was the concept of that it's not the load, it's how we carry it, which is not to invalidate heaviness, but really connecting to that concept of that the prison isn't the circumstance, but it really is how we view it. And that doesn't mean we have to stay. Again, it's that acceptance. So this is where I'm at, or this is what the circumstance is. Now what?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to stay stuck. I'm not giving up my power, but I'm using my brain to my advantage. So I'm out of that. I'm moving through those states to my executive state to have control of what I really do have control of.
You're choosing different small choices or opportunities to become more like the version of yourself, that you've been thinking about, or, not saying this life is wrong. This is not where, what I'm supposed to be, but to just say, what if it's not the wrong life? I just need to think about each choice I make and how those choices can make it different, if different is what I want.
Right. What's the next thing I'm going to do to bring more joy? Not that I have a depletion of joy, but to have more joy.
Thanks for tuning in to This Was Supposed to Be Easy. Remember, the best stories are the ones we live.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep the conversation going, because life may not be easy, but listening in should be.
Stay curious, stay connected, and keep wondering.